Okay, so last time we were discussing the Indian of the medical and scientific, but in particularly medical knowledge expressed in Chazal. So I ended off. We mentioned that there's a long shtickle in the Nishmas Avram from Professor Dr. Avram Sefer Abraham in Siman Dalet and Arachayim, where he's Meirich and he brings many examples of Chazal's Yediyah in something that's medical long before the actual medical world internalized this information. Now, there's many examples that he brings, and some of them are from Gemaras, and some of them are from other Memari Chazal, Midrashim, etc. But there's one in particular that I want to zoom in on, and focus on a little bit, and that is hemophilia. Now, this is a fascinating thing. Hemophilia is a disease that was only diagnosed, I think, only discovered or codified in the mid 1800s. There's hemophilia A and hemophilia B, and basically what it is that the person who's afflicted with hemophilia, his blood is lacking the ability to coagulate and to clot properly, and therefore even minor injuries or whatever it could be very detrimental for him, because he could bleed out. It causes internal bleeding, external bleeding. It's a severe ailment. It's a hereditary ailment. Now, there's something fascinating about hemophilia, is that it's a recessive condition that comes through the mother's genes, meaning women are carriers of hemophilia, and their sons could inherit that tendency. So the mother will be asymptomatic; she's just a carrier of the disease, and the sons of said mother will be symptomatic and could be sufferers from hemophilia. Now, one of the most fascinating cases of hemophilia in the world is Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria was the British queen in the mid and late 1800s. I think she was born in 1810. She was a very rebbesh mishpacha. She did shidduchim with most of the royalty in Europe at the time, with Russian royalty, with Habsburg royalty, with I think French royalty, and therefore her yichus and her genetic conditions were inherited by many of the kings and queens. Well, through the queens, but of the kings in all throughout Europe, in the 19th century and the 20th century. She had a son, I forgot his name now, the Duke of something, who actually died from hemophilia. He got a small injury while he was in Paris when he was 30 years old, and he had internal bleeding and he bled to death. They had no idea what it was, meaning they knew that there were bleeders in the family. That's what they were called then, bad bleeders. But not more than that. Actually, the Tsar of Russia, Tsar Nikolai II, married an anicle of Queen Victoria, and she was a carrier of hemophilia B, which the family had, and her son, Alexei, who was supposed to be the Yerush, he was the crown prince, he was a hemophiliac, and allegedly historians say that the reason why Rasputin, who was a mysterious and mystical character, who is probably a co-conspirator to bringing down the Russian monarchy in the early 1900s, was only brought into the family to cope with the hemophilia of Alexei. He was able to help the family. He had some sort of medical knowledge, some sort of primitive medical knowledge. This hemophilia gene found its way through many of the royal families in Europe, and eventually Queen Victoria's progeny became less desirable as for a shidduch, because the women, it was always suspect that a princess from the house of Queen Victoria could be carrying the hemophilia gene. Now, in any case, the reason why I'm mentioning this is because there's a fascinating component of the hemophilia gene, and that is that it gets carried through the mothers, and it's a recessive gene, meaning it's not a gene that the men get. The men get it through their mothers. That's how they get the gene. Now, what's interesting about this is that Chazal, way ahead of the discovery of hemophilia in the 1800s, seemed to be very aware of the exact tchunas of hemophilia. And that's from a Bakanta Sugya, the Gemara in Yevamos and the Samach Taladim and Beis. It handles the Sugya as follows. It brings a machlekes between Rebbe and another man Amar as follows. It's the Tanya. We learned in the Brisa, Milah Harishain, if a person, now Milah is Lashon Nekeva, which is interesting. Again, we're focusing clearly on the mother here. If the mother's first son got a bris, umeis, Sheni umeis, then the second son of said mother got a bris and dies, Shlishi loy samul. The third one shouldn't get a bris already. Divrei Rebbe. That's Rabbi Shita. Because Rabbi holds that betray pam have a chazaka. With 2 times, you could already establish a chazaka that this family is mesu machmas milah. They're people who die from the circumcision. which incidentally Chazal reference Ki Alecha Haragnu Kol Hayom. There's a Chazal that says that's referring to Milah, because Milah is known to be somewhat dangerous, but Milah is supposed to be normal dangerous, not extremely dangerous. And if it's Hochzak, that the family is Mesim Machmas Milah, so we don't give the Milah. Now, Rav Shimon Gamliel says Shlishi Tamul, the third son should get a Milah. He's Mechuyev to get a Milah. Revi Lo Samul, the fourth son shouldn't get a Milah, because he says you need three confirmed deaths in order to turn it into chazaka. Now the Gemara brings some fascinating stories, anecdotal stories that relate to this din as rayas. The Gemara says, Tashma Amar Rav Chiya bar Abba Rav Yechanan, Ma'isa barba achiyas b'tzipari. There was a story with four sisters in Tzipari. Shemala Rishayna Umeis. The first sister one, had a son who got a misbrila and he died. Shnia, the second sister, had a son, Umeis. He also died from the Milah. Shlishis, the third sister, had Umeis and she died too. Her child died too. Revius, the fourth one, Balafnei Rav Shimon Gamliel, came in front of Rav Shimon Gamliel. Amallah, he told her, Al Tamaili, don't give a meal to the son because he's going to die from the Milah. So the Gemara says, no, this is not a raya. Dilmi Asir Shlishis Nami Have Amalei. This is, it could have been that he would have said this about 3 too. So we don't have a raya to if it's 2 or it's 3, but we see a discussion about it. And later on down the Amud, the Gemara brings various more details about this, and then the Gemara says like this. The Gemara says an interesting line. It says, Bishlam Agabi Milah, Ika Mishpacha de Rafi Dama, Ika Mishpacha de Kamet Dama. There are families that have thin blood and families that have thick blood, meaning families that have the ability to congeal and to coagulate and therefore to not bleed out, and families that have thin blood, so to speak, that it doesn't have the ability to coagulate and therefore they bleed out. So what's fascinating is that the Gemara is clearly describing the disease over here that causes Mesim Achmas Milah as a blood disease, a disease that's related to the blood, i.e. hemophilia, this disease that was only diagnosed and known about much later. And what's clear from the Gemara over here is a fascinating thing. The Gemara is only focusing on the women. The Gemara talks about in the beginning, Milah, the first one, the child of the first woman, her second child, her third child. And then what's even more fascinating is that the Gemara segues on to a case of sisters. Now sisters, it's not even the same mother. Now if you didn't understand that this was a recessive gene that goes through the females of a family, it would be hard to understand what the Gemara is talking about. But the Gemara is referencing to hemophilia, which is a recessive gene that goes through the mother. It makes absolute sense to diagnose it based on sisters. If you see multiple sisters who are suffering, their children are suffering with the same hemophilia, the same inability to coagulate, then you know that this family is afflicted with this blood disease. They're a mishpacha de rafi dama. They have loose blood that can't congeal, and therefore they are considered mesim achmas milah. Now, although in the Paiskim, in the Rishonim really, in the Paiskim and the Rishonim and Zgebrach and Shulchan Aruch, there is a day in the Rishonim that says that even if it's from the father's side, even a paternal family where you see that from the father's side, several of the uncles, let's say, have children who mesim achmas milah, we would also treat it. But l'chayr, you could say that that's just like l'chumra b'alma, like chamir sekanta meisura. We want to be extra careful. But yich this Gemara seems to be very aware of something that modern science did not know for probably 1,800 years or 1,700 years after this Gemara was written. Now, the problem is like this. This is a shtickle issue that I just want to talk about in this Gemara, and then we'll move on to maybe some other examples. The problem is like this. Hemophilia is incurable, as far as I know. It's a genetic disorder, it's incurable. Now, what is possible, and this is modern medicine, they are able to give injections to the blood to replace artificially whatever enzyme is missing that's needed to trigger scabbing and congealing, and therefore they could get even someone who's a hemophiliac, generally speaking, to not bleed out from a minor injury. Now, but keeping that in mind, there's something interesting, because the Gemara in Shabbos and Kuflam Dal Amud Aleph brings a story with Reb Nassan. It's a famous Gemara. The Gemara says like this: Amar Reb Nassan, Pamachas alachti lekarchei hayam. One time I went to a faraway place, ubasi ishachas lefanai, and a woman came to me, Shemala b'na Rishon umeis, Sheni umeis, Shlishi eviasi lefanai. She brought her third son in front of me to ask if the son could have a milah. Reisiv shu adaim, I saw that he was red. Amarti la hamtini lai, ad sheyivala b'ydamai. He's somewhat hypertensive and his blood is not absorbed properly, or his blood is not oxygenated properly, which you could tell by the skin tone, and therefore wait until his blood is absorbed properly. She waited until his blood was absorbed. She mauled him, and he lived. And they named him Nasan Abavli Ashmi. Shuv Ma'isa'achas, Shuv Hamachas. Again, he says, Halachti Lemdinas Kaputkia. I went to another far out place. Ubasi Isha'achas Lefana Shemala ben Arisha Numeis, Sheni Umeis, Shlisha Vi Lefana V'Yisif Shu Yarek. I saw that he was green, which is again another diagnostic tool. Today we have yellow, and today we have bilirubin counters, and we have the ability to check on the conditions that are probably being referenced in this Gemara, and that's a whole arichas sugya about when we wait and when we don't wait by a Milah, and how long do you have to wait from the baby heals, and what type of fevers, and etc. Not our topic for today, but he says, I witnessed the baby was symptomatic of something that clearly seemed to be a hematological disorder, a blood disorder. I looked at him closely. Rav Nassan is obviously a very good diagnostician. I looked at him closely, and I see that his blood is not where it needs to be holding. The health of his blood is not where it needs to be holding to have a Milah. Wait until his dam settles. So Nasan Abavli in the Gemara and Shabbos of Kuf Lamed Aleph recounts several stories of his involvement in postponing the Milah of children who seem to display blood ailments that he was able to diagnose based on the coloring of their skin. And because of that, they were called Ashmai. Now, what's interesting about this Gemara is the Gemara seemingly seems to be referencing the same illnesses that are referenced in the Gemara and Yivamis. And over here, the Gemara is talking about them in the context of that they're curable, they're time sensitive, meaning you just have to wait until they go away, and then everything will be resolved. Meaning they're not permanent ailments that stick around. They seem to be time-sensitive ailments, is the way the Gemara seems to be describing them. Now, what's shver to understand is that if the Gemara in Yivamis is describing hemophilia, which it seems like it is, and it's way ahead of the curve and way ahead of its time, and Chazal seem to be expressing knowledge of something that is way ahead of the medical world of those times. Why then does the Gemara in Yivamis describe it as something that's curable? Hemophilia, as far as we know, especially hemophilia B, which is the deadly and dangerous one, the more uncommon but dangerous one, is something that is incurable. Now, what's interesting like this, there's a tshuva from the Noda B'Yehuda in Yerdei Tinyan in Simkov Samachay that addresses something interesting. It's a shayla like this. He says, Mechtavi kibalti v'advar tinik ben shalish shanim, about a baby who's 3 years old, v'adayin le'nimel, he didn't get a bris yet, ki shloisha acham akadumim loy, 3, which is the most machmer shita, the most kula, however you want to say it, kula chumra, the most kula dikashit in the Gemara in Yivamis. Shloisha achiv hakoidim loy mesu machmas milas, 3 brothers died before him. V'kvar hezarti shalay yimaru l'moyloi ad sheyedieni mahos briusei. And I already instructed you, it seems like the Noda B'Yehuda was involved in the shayla at an earlier point, he said, I already instructed you not to give this kid a bris until you update me about the status of his health. Even by the third one, it wasn't what you were supposed to do. Because that's when we paskin like Rebbe by Milah that even with 2 times it's considered a chazako. Put chazima also, and look what happened to him. Look what befell him. Shemeis Machmili, he ended up dying because of his circumcision. This 4th child, the 4th son of the family, who's already 3 years old, be'emes, says the Noda B'Yehuda, and this is a very interesting line, punchy line. He says be'emes, Ilav Rambam in Parak Aleph Milah Alachid Ches, V'hator in Yeridei Seminary Samach Gimel, V'anamuki Yosef B'Yivamis Afanor in Samach Daled, Amru Shloi Tamal Ashlishi B'Zmanoi, Elam Amtinun Lo Yechi Yigala V'Yichazik Koichai. If not that the Rambam, the Torah, and the Namuki Yosef are all saying on the Gemara and Yivamis that we delay the Milah. None of them learn the Gemara. They don't learn the Gemara to say, even though the Pashas of the Gemara and the way Rashi sounds like, is this child who's Meso Achmas Achmas Milah, once it's Hochsak, that it's a family of bleeders, the child doesn't need a Milah at all. But these other Rishonim, the Torah, the Rift, and Namuki Yosef, the Torah, the Namuki Yosef, the Rambam, they seem to say that we push it off at Sheigalda v'Yechazik Koichai. Says the Noda B'Yehuda, if not that they said that Hayisi ani Choichich Shlei L'moyle Klal. I would say that this child shouldn't get a Milah at all. Ki Stama Amru B'Yivamis Samach Daled Amru Shlishi Lo Tamol. The Pashtus HaGemara is not to get a Milah at all. V'chein Harif v'Harasham Yivamis Hatiku Stam Shlishi Lo Tamol. They paskin just Stam Shlishi Lo Tamol. Says the Noda B'Yehuda, V'amnam the Masechta Shabbos Kuf Lamed Amud Aleph Tanya Amar of Nassan, and he brings the whole story. Says you see from the Gemara over there that there is some sort of thing, and it's not permanent. It seems to be a raya to the Deis Rishonim that say that it's just you just push off the Milah, and when the child gets better, you do give this child a bris. So he says Achzeh Yesh Liyashiv Dimkein Lam Hisker of Nassan Klal Shemalu Rishonim Shnei Meis. Tzarachlem V'Doichik says Kivin Shor Nassan Le'Ra Shnei Ladam Rishonim Hayle Lachash Ulei Rishonim Lahei Adumim V'Akapanim Meisu. Veichis hit the lamozach shivala by dame v'akapanim oile lachker levada shemachmas misa rishani ain't peida hashem v'shlini. He brings the raya from this Gemara. Now, he's matchir eventually. Then it says zeh nearly niestaiti liyashiv. That's a poskim now. He says that this Gemara in Shabbos is the makar to serve for these poskim. V'kivin shah Rambam v'Namuki Yosef v'Torah v'Shulchan Aruch pasku kain miyav l'har achareim l'chein matina kazer ruuyin royim b'shu bari v'chazik adarach kol shar b'nei gimel shanim. The Gammar upon of Tzehuvim v'le Yerakis, his color is appropriate. Yemolu Yosef v'tayv lashkiach she'ebizman shayim huzacha avir And make sure you do it on a day that Zacha Ave, which is another fascinating detail that he's referring to, which is what the Gemara in Yevamah says, that the Klal Yisrael didn't get Milas in the Midbar because it was cloudy. There was no clouds. There was no sunlight. Whatever, a different shmuz for a different day. But Yiach Shia, the Ned Yehuda, is, so to speak, addressing mamish the nakuda of our question. The Yehuda is pointing out that the Gemara in Yevamah sounds like it could be describing, hemophilia, which is incurable, and the third child should never get a milah at all. Mitzacheni, the Gemara in Shabbos sounds like it could be curable, and therefore the Ned Yehuda says he used to Rishayim learns from the Gemara in Shabbos that it's curable. So Belas Breira, that's what we have to do, and Min Hashemayim Yirachamu. Now the Ned Yehuda's son and the Haggais and the Ben Mechaber over here, he has a long Haggah with a kasha and a marsha. I'm not going to go into it now, but he has a long Haggah with a kasha and a marsha where he does say that Taisvis' day it could be is that the cases are different. It could be the case of Rav Nassim in the Gemara in Shabbos is referring to a different case. Then he says, I'll read you a little bit. He says, "Afize yeshleimar the mashahiter of Nassim lama lashlishi achash nivla beidamai hayil v'gam bezer yishayim lehuchzik u'shemesim achmas milah alamach mashayu adumim." He says that the symptoms and the diagnosis of what this illness was that caused the first two children to die was a different illness. It was because they were near adumim. If there was no external symptoms, no hypertensive or bilirubin related symptoms that could be diagnosed by looking at the skin, or somewhat diagnosed by looking at the skin, and therefore it is actually hemophilia and a blood disease. So what's interesting is it's hard to know if the Ned Yehuda's son is coming from a conversation that he had with his father, and the Ned Yehuda Be'etzem held L'daitoi, and he just felt he have to. It's hard to say exactly. This is the Hagam Ben Mechaber on his own, in which case it has somewhat of a diluted street value. All being that he was a big Talmid Chacham, the Ned Yehuda's son, but he wasn't the Ned Yehuda. But Yiach Shia, there is a version to separate these two Gemaras and say that there are two different illnesses that are being discussed. Like today, in the modern medical world, there are two different illnesses. There's hemophilia, which is a genetic disorder, which is incurable. And then there are other more temporary matters, when a baby's yellow, and it escapes me this minute what the exact medical term for that is. But those are more temporary and have a lot of Pesach Shareit, exactly when and how and what the amount of time, what the numbers, etc. Whatever. That's a very modern halacha shayla. B'yiach the Ned Yehuda is addressing this nekuda. Now, hanirali, what one could say, and we see this from time to time, and we saw this last week when we discussed the various different achronim that discussed this, is that it's possible that b'mei Chazal they knew of refuahs that we don't have. Like we know, b'mei Chazal originally they had the book from Chizkiah with all the refuahs. Later on, when that was destroyed, so Chazal still had various Mesiras, according to many of the achronim that we discussed, on various different refuahs. And it's yitachan that we could say that even though today hemophilia is considered a genetic disease that's incurable, maybe Chazal did know of some remedy that blunted the hemophiliac's issue and allowed the hemophilia to have a milah later on, like Zmash from the Gemara on Shabbos, or perhaps you could separate it like the Ned Yehuda's son is doing, or we could b'lai b'sarachin. But Yiach Shia, this is a quintessential example of Chazal's tremendous head of the curve perceptive knowledge of medical issues that modern medicine only discovered and codified relatively recently. Now, let's just throw in a few more from the Nishmas Avram in Simon Dalet over there. So he has a few very interesting ones, very cute ones, and I'll share some of those. He says, for example, mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, which is today, I believe, standard practice for someone who needs resuscitation, someone who at least it's the first step for someone who needs resuscitation. So he says that's something that was discovered, only the exact protocols of mouth-to-mouth resuscitation is seemingly, and I'm not a doctor, but it seems they were first, written into medical lore in the 1960s. He says he has a makar from Chazal, and he brings a very interesting medrash. The medrash, it's a Yalkut Shemaini in Parsha Shlach. The medrash says like this. It says, Higio meraglim l'chevrein, tzavach behem talmai tzvacha achas. So Talmai, the giant, yelled at them one, sharp scream. V'naflu al pnei artza, and they collapsed onto the ground on their faces, seemingly knocked out. Hischilu menafchem b'fiyim u'menashvim ba'apam etshnisyash v'daitem aleim. So the Mefarshim say the Zeis Ranan over there. It says menafchem b'fiyim anshe knan or menafchem b'fiyim k'dei la'achyosim. The anshe knan were blowing into their mouths to resuscitate them. So here you have an example of mouth-to-mouth resuscitation that's being documented from a story well ahead of the modern medical knowledge of it. Another one, for example, he says is intubation. Intubation is another step in someone who's not breathing on his own, and the way they slide a tube down the person's throat to open up an airwave. Now, it says as follows: this is like a cute one. The Balaturim in Shemais, he says as follows: by the Miyaldis, he says Kederach HaMiyaldish Lepa'amim Shavlad Noilad Meis. It could happen that a child could be born dead. Lekachas HaMiyaldis Shvefera Shel Kana. So the Miyaldis takes a Shvefera Shel Kana, like a thin reed, Umasima Toich Meyav Shel Yelad Menafchaboy Meshiva Ruach Liyelad V'zeh Shifra Lashon Shveiferes. The Balaturim is bringing down, maybe it's based on a medrash that we don't have anymore, that says that the Lashon Shifra, which Chazal say other reasons for it, but Shifra, Shveiferes, Lashon Shveiferes, that they used some sort of intubation or some sort of technique of intubation to resuscitate children who were born, not breathing. Now, another example, he says, for example, modern anesthesia, putting someone out to sleep completely for a medical procedure, for a surgery or whatever, is a few hundred years old. It's not older than that. But the Gemara in Bamitzia, on Daf Pegimel Mebeis, the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara, when it talks about a surgery, it says, Ashku Samad Shinasa. They gave him the sleeping potion to drink. Now, it's Yitachin, and I think that even some Rishonim learn like this, that Ashku Samad Shinasa is alcohol, strong alcohol, hard alcohol, that can put a person, numb a person's senses, maybe even put him to sleep. But others suggest that this is some sort of earlier notion of a full anesthetic that Chazal seem to have been aware of, way ahead. Now, Stam, interestingly, is the Gemara B'Metzia discusses gastrosurgeries, gastroenterological surgeries, different procedures like removing fat and etc., liposuction or those type of procedures. Again, maybe not exactly in the same way that modern medicine does it, but clearly discussing, procedures related to shrinking the stomach, which is, until recently, was a very popular medical procedure even in our times. Another important detail is that the idea that diseases or viruses could be mosquito-borne or borne by bugs or, to transfer from person to person was only discovered in the last 200 years. For example, they discovered that malaria is mosquito-borne illness in 1881. They discovered that the common plague, is borne by mosquitoes in 1898. They discovered that the typhoid fever, the typhoid is carried by animals in 1909. Now, Mitzacheni, the Gemara in Ksubas, in the Fain Zayin and Beis, Rav Yochanan says, Hizaru mizvuve shel balei rasan. Rashi Afanot says, Zvuve mashoichen alav kashes lahavi yisecheli alishacher. The flies that are hanging out with the balei rasan, which it's a question what the modern medical diagnosis of balei rasan is. We've talked about this in the past. It's a contagious disease, so it's relevant to the discussions of virology and pandemics that we've had in the past. But the Gemara is clearly is aware of some sort of bug-borne transmission of illnesses that modern science didn't know for a long time. Now, an interesting one that I found fascinating is the Gemara in Shabbos. It's really a Mishnah, I think. In Shabbos Amchem et Aleph, the Mishnah says as follows. It says, Yoitze besela shalatzinis. A person's allowed to go out wearing a sela, which means, a coin, that's alatzinis. Rashi explains, Maka sheitacha parsas haregel, a makkah that a person could have in the arch of his foot, v'kosher by cellular refuah, and he ties a cellular refuah. So Rashi says that use a specific coin. Rashi gives us some details, and Rashi says the lachluchas hayotzim and hakesef is yafa lamaka. The natural, excretions of the metal in the coin is beneficial to the healing process of the wound. Now today there are various creams that the active ingredient is silver. Now pashtus, the coin that's being referenced over there, is the sela is a silver coin. And silver has some sort of healing properties. For example, I believe silverdine, which is a common burn treatment. I could be wrong, but I think it's based on silver. And I think there are others that are silver based, meaning harnessing the properties of these metals to help bring a cure to the person. Another one, for example, there's about I'm trying to see which ones are worthy of sharing. One second. He obviously brings hemophilia that we were Myrich on for a while. He's a little bit of a shorter version, but he brings the hemophilia diseases. He separates the Gemara in Shabbos and the Gemara in Yivamitz. The Gemara in Yivamitz he puts into a different category. I'm sorry, the Gemara in Shabbos the Gemara in Shabbos is in a category about what's it called, anemic babies. a different one. Now, there's another one that he has over here. This is an interesting one. The Gemara in Shabbos Daf Samach Vav Beis says as follows. It says, Yotzin be'evan tkuma b'Shabbos, v'lo she'epila el Hashem atapil, v'lo she'ibra el Hashem tesaber v'tapil. The Gemara tells us that a woman is allowed to go out carrying an evan tkuma on Shabbos, not if she already had a miscarriage, even if she might have a miscarriage, not even if it's known that she's pregnant, even if she might be pregnant. And Hashem ataber v'tapil. And this is gebracht in Shulchan Aruch, in Siman Shin Gimel, and Sif Chavtal. The Shulchan Aruch brings this. And the shaila is, what is this talking about? What's the Shem Tapel? What's the Shem Tesaber V'Tapel? What's going on over here? So he quotes a medical study that was done in the United States about 40 years ago, where they found that 22% of women who are pregnant and have abortions have the abortions before they even know that they're pregnant. Not abortions, sorry, have miscarriages, have a miscarriage even before they ever know they're pregnant. I think it's called a chemical miscarriage. So he suggests, Nirali says, Shechazal Baruch Kachem Amru Shem Tesaber Chazal, who were aware that there's a danger of miscarriage already at a very, very early stage, meaning a chemical miscarriage that could happen very, very early, at an early stage, are already allowing a woman to go out carrying on Shabbos certain things. Now he has a few different ones. Interesting one about Isha Misabera Samach Levesta. There's a Gemara Nida that says that a woman is only, the Gemara Nida Lamed Aleph and Beis says that a woman is only Misaber Samach Levesta, and here it goes through a whole calculation of ovulation, etc., which I'm not going to go into. There's Chazal say, Ober Adar B'Am Yem is Maya Ba'alma. He explains how that works in the medical world. Basically, he says, and without going too much detail, but basically he says, the embryo in utero, before 40 days, although it's visible on an ultrasound, meaning the clump of cells that is going to develop into a child is already visible on an ultrasound, but it has no tzuras adam. It doesn't have any shape that could be easily recognizable to be a human. It's just a clump. After about the 40-day mark is when the embryo in utero already takes on some sort of human-like shape. Meaning you could see this on with a CAT scan or an MRI. I'm not exactly sure if this is. I'm not a CAT scan. I'm sorry. Probably an ultrasound. An ultrasound you can see this. So that's what he suggests. He explains that. Now he goes on and on. He explains something interesting. This is not popular to say this, but in the 70s this was common. He says, Chazal say Omer of Simloi. It's a medrash in a Bereshis Rabbah and Yerushalmi inside the Chazal say Omer of Simloi b'chal makom shatamoitzi's nos under lumusya bala oilim v'hirages tevim v'raim. Like Magefa comes, the Yosef says, and it destroys tevim v'raim. So he suggests the AIDS pandemic, which started from whoever it started, is a kiyum of this Chazal. He shows typhus in the Gemara, and it goes on and on. And he shows all these various different zachen. Now. What's interesting, and then at the end of this whole paragraph over here, he collects all the various different quotes from the Rishonim. He quotes from a Chuvas Rashba and from a Rivash, and these are, striking Mar Makaimis, where these Rishonim write very clearly that we prioritize Chachmei Yisrael over the Chachmei Ateva, and etc. And now the truth is that I don't know if we'll do it next week or we'll get to it at some point, but the truth is that the Rashba and his Shita relating to how we look at the science and the medical knowledge conveyed in Chazal is a fascinating discussion on its own. Professor Abrams quotes some of the Rajman there, but he quotes it to his ends and not thoroughly quoting the entirety of the Rajba Shita. The entirety of the Rajba Shita, Sai as it relates to Treifus and Sai as it relates to medical knowledge and other scientific knowledge, is a fascinating discussion that maybe is a good continuation point from here. Either we'll get to it or we won't, but to be continued.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.